Welcome to this session on From Studio to Page, Publishing Practices Research. My name is Michael Schwab, and I will guide you through the next 40 minutes or so of content around artistic research. I'll be doing this mostly through a PowerPoint presentation that I prepared for you, so you will see my face speaking most of the time in a small window at the top right of your video screen, such as this. Before I start, however, I'd like to briefly say a few words about myself and the Journal for Artistic Research, which I'm editing. I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal. I'm the inaugural editor-in-chief of the journal, which means that we've done a lot of conceptual groundwork to support artists and researchers as much as we can in getting their practice on the page and doing justice to the various requirements that people have. I myself am a photographer by trade, but over the last years mostly interested in post-conceptual fine art practice. I'm also a philosopher by trade. I've studied at the University of Hamburg quite a long time ago in continental philosophy, and I've always been interested in question of aesthetics and epistemology, which you may bring together under the notion of sense. There's sense in meaning, but there's also sense in experiences, and that has really been my key interest. The Journal for Artistic Research, you can find it online at jar-online.net. Has been around for 10 years, as I said. It's currently on issue 23. It's an international journal, although we mostly publish contributions in English. We do accept, however, also contributions since very recently in Spanish, Portuguese, as well as German. It's online. There's no printed version of this, and there's not even a PDF version of this due to the media nature of the work we publish. It's open access, so neither authors have to pay to publish at JAR, nor do audiences need to pay subscription fees. And it's peer-reviewed, so we've got a rather large, quite interesting peer review process of at least 3 reviewers who are looking at a submission. I'm going to talk about this towards the end of this presentation a bit more. We are really interested in disseminating artistic research from all disciplines, including disciplines that you would not necessarily count as belonging to the arts. For example, we published submissions from visual anthropology. When we conceived of the journal, we were looking for a basically rich media, and also non-linear publishing platform. We couldn't find one at the time, so we gained some funding to create the research catalog. This is quite a large, again, also free space, which researchers across the world use to collaborate, host their data, and also publish in various institutional portals belonging to universities and journals as well. The research catalog is provided by the Society for Artistic Research, a learned society that also publishes the Journal for Artistic Research. Within the research catalog, I've got a profile. Everybody else can have a profile as well, but this is my profile here. And if you browse to that, you can also listen to a number of additional recordings, as well as most of the materials I published myself and some limited artistic outputs, which I'm also hosting there. It's really like a rich media profile as you would find it in academia.edu, for example. As I suggested, practice is something that we find rather important but difficult to grasp. We are looking at practice as something that is virtually anything, which means without additional work, it will be very difficult to actually know specifically what practice somebody is talking about. Practice is very open ended, it may change in the future, it is owned by individual artists who are very often deeply engaged with that, but are not creating any conceptual frameworks to describe specifically what it is they're doing. On the other hand, we've got academic writing, which is often highly codified, it's very formalized and structured. And as artistic researchers, we often need to work in both worlds. We need to work in the studio, we need to create meaningful artifacts and outcomes from the studio, but we also have to write academically, and we have to publish academically in the context, for instance, of journals, books, and other media. Now, it is hoped that practice somehow influences what we write. So practice is not set separate from the process of writing, but it also may influence how we are writing. So what kinds of narratives we are following, and likewise, we do hope that whatever we're developing at the site of writing will actually feed back into practice and will change what we do in the studio. So it's a bit like a feedback loop between practice and writing, between the studio and the page, if you want to. And we're interested in zooming in to this particular space as much as we can. At the same time, if you're looking at what's happening around practice from a more sociological level and also cultural level, you'll see that there are very different networks at play with different languages and different social behaviors. So artistic practitioners are not necessarily sharing the same language than academic researchers do, and that's represented here by these two bubbles that are not necessarily overlapping. At the same time, as artistic researchers interested in bringing practice and writing closer together, we have to not just breach these different forms of work, but we also have to breach different social backgrounds, different expectations, different cultural practices. And that's really one of the key concerns and the key problem that you'll encounter if you are trying to move from the studio to the page in the publishing of your research. For today, I'd like to focus mainly on this one dimension that has been suggested in the title of this talk, From Practice to Writing. That means, how do we get actually from the materials that we generate in the studio to research output that are published, and how is that publishing actually adding to and enhancing our research practice overall? As a way to start this and to introduce you to this, I'd like to structure what I'm going to say by looking at various methods that could be employed. Often within scientific research output, we're looking at quantitative methods, i.e. methods that look at things that can be counted and analyzed statistically, for example. And we do encounter this as well in the context of artistic research. For instance, people may be using questionnaires that they're analyzing. People also sometimes use data collected at the site of exhibitions, including sensor data that is being looked at statistically in order to derive some meaningful outcomes from this. But by and large, within our field of practice, quantitative methods are very limited and limiting. So most people will be looking at qualitative elements, i.e. Data that's collected but not statistically analyzed. For instance, it could be interviews where artists speak about their work. It could be reflective pieces of writing. It could be documents that are being created and so on. If I'm looking at that side of things, I would suggest that some of the methods focus on the content, i.e. an artist is speaking about, for instance, the work they do in their studio, or somebody describes a picture or a painting, or analyzes a symphony. very much looking at actually the mode of communication of this particular description itself. But some people actually also are very much interested in the form that takes, i.e., that there's an artistic dimension to the practice of communicating elements of art, i.e., you can speak about art artistically, and you can speak about art, say, philosophically or with a background of cultural studies, and the form that you're going to choose will be very different. If you want to highlight particular aesthetic elements, it makes sense to actually demonstrate those, and demonstrate those at the site of writing and the site of publishing, so a reader can actually trace what it is that you're referring to. I'm going to get to this further down the line, but this is, as far as I'm concerned, the most difficult part of our process. It's fairly easy to look at statistics and numbers and the kind of methods that are employed. It's, again, fairly easy to write a piece of reflection or to interpret something, but it's much more difficult to actually demonstrate why a particular piece of work works the way it works and what the meaning of this work then is. And that's what I want to focus in first, and most importantly, because as we move from the studio to the page, we don't necessarily want to leave behind the kinds of experiences that we've made in the studio, because they will be important for our readers to understand why what it is we're doing is relevant to them. This whole set of possible methods I call expositional. I'm going to get to this again in a moment, but just to say that this notion of exposition is something we coined ourselves, and it's important that it includes the aesthetic or artistic side of things. So what's listed here at the bottom, the form the publication takes is crucial and is always being looked at. Now, next to JAR, there's a number of journals on the research catalog and also off the research catalog that are really interested in artistic research and the voice that comes out of studio contexts within and goes into academia. So here's an example of Huku, the studies in artistic research that's published out of Finland. It's a journal that also is hosted on the research catalog, as well as VIS, the Nordic Journal for Artistic Research. Again, something that is been published on the research catalog. There's other journals, such as Pars Journal, that is published out of Sweden, where the format, the media format that's been chosen for publication is much more traditional. Text blocks, image or video sections and so on are in there, as well as, for example, the Oxford Artistic and Practice-Based Research Platform. It's another recent journal that's there. Or Groundworks in the States, initiative that focuses in particular on interdisciplinary collaboration. These are more recent journals, including Ellipsis, which is published within South Africa. Now here, and that's quite interesting, we've got an example where designers are actually working together with the artists and researchers to create their contributions, i.e. you've got collaborations that support the mode in which artworks may be presented. We at JAR, we don't necessarily employ that specific designers to help us create the final outputs that we have. So we expect people to do this themselves or collaborate with people themselves. But in the process of peer review, copy editing, and what we call design editing, a lot happens to these submissions that we receive. So check out Ellipsis, that's an interesting initiative there. But also if you go to more traditional journals, such as Leonardo, you'll see that increasingly people are submitting media content as well, mostly images, but also videos. And you will find a lot of specialist journals that don't necessarily talk about artistic research, who are interested in media elements as part of their submissions. Here's an example from Belgium. It's called ECHO, the Journal for Music, Thought and Technology, or the Journal of Embodied Research, which I added to this list here because it interestingly only accepts submissions as videos. So you can't submit the text, you have to send a video file in there. There's a lot around now, and you'll have to think a little bit about what are the right journals for your research, and which ones may actually not work for you. And once you decide a little bit on that, you have to think what types of media are they accepting, how far can you go, but also what media requirements might you have that come from your studio that you find important to become part of a submission you're making to these journals. Going back to this diagram, as I showed earlier, moving from practice to writing, I want to suggest that it's not such a novel situation. I just picked one book out of my shelf, Echo Objects. I could have taken any other book to tell you how it normally works. Normally, in a, say, academic book publication, you'll be writing a chapter, a book, a large amount of text here, and you'll be featuring examples or illustrations of art through these little figures that are being put at the margins of that. So the key argument is carried by the text, and you can see that here clearly. It's illustrated by small scale, sometimes plates, but often small scale images with a bit of a description there, but they're nothing more than illustrations. They don't carry the argument. They're supporting an argument made in text. Or, in other words, the text may be interpreting what's in the work, but it's nevertheless the text that actually defines the meaning of that work. If we're moving into more artistic sides, I want to show you this example by David Hockney, somebody who's worked before artistic research as a dominant term has hit universities, and his concern isn't really doctoral education, but he's done, as an artist, a lot of art historical research and research into the way artists may or may not have used optics to create paintings in the history of art. Now, here's a book called Secret Knowledge. It's been reprinted multiple times. And you'll see by looking at the table of contents, things have changed already in terms of the quantities. There's a large section in which David Hockney collects visual evidence from page 18 to 232. And there's a section of textual evidence where he works textually, which is much, much smaller. So first of all, the table of contents tells us we're dealing with visual evidence and visual materials. And if you open the book even further, that's what you encounter. Big images taking the whole of the page. There's no space for text here. Proper foregrounding of art. Very little commentary. Trusting that an informed reader will actually get something out of this kind of opening gambit. An understanding of, here we look at art, here we operate through visual narratives, here we create visual relationship between things, even if at this moment, when I'm opening the book, I'm not yet too clear how that's going to unfold. But I'm set up in very particular ways. So as the book is being looked at further, you'll see these kinds of pages, which basically are details Hockney wants us to zoom into, and small sections of text, labels, that explain a little bit, but they're not labels like we've seen earlier, where you've got figure 1 and then a bit of a text, but actually labels that are very much the voice of the artist, and they're written in a way that adds to the reading of whatever page is being presented here. such as this: Ingres opposite, Warhol above. I know that Warhol used a projector to make drawings like this. His line has an obvious traced look. It was seeing this drawing that made me recognize a similarity to the close in Ingres' portraits, and so on. So the way this works here is that the text is guiding me to a particular reading of that work by Warhol and then comparing it to a work of Ingres on the other side. So I'm looking at this text as an instruction to seeing, and I'm tracing that in the work, and I'm confirming, yeah, I can see that too, and so on. So evidence is being built up through the visual elements, but guided through those labels on the side. And then, of course, included are what you may call comparisons. On the left here, we see different sketches by Ingres that help us to understand the visual cosmos, you might say, of his studio. But then there's also a more extended sketch on the right where we see actually things not quite fitting, and Hockney will talk about this as well. So the face here looks maybe slightly out of proportion. It's also done in a different way, different style of work, much more worked out compared to the rest of the figure. And it's those kinds of distributions that Hockney is interested in, because he's arguing that painters, even in singular paintings, have used different types of techniques to achieve the results that they're after. So here's, for example, a painting that we would normally look at as a singular work done in one way. There's the sitter, here's the canvas, here's the painter. But Hockney argues that this section at the bottom here, this cloth and the weaving of the cloth, is actually can only have been made by using optical devices. As he says, the fabric draped over Madame Leblanc's chair could not, I believe, have been done without some optical help. The pattern follows the fold flawlessly, and so on. And we take, of course, this statement from a painter, from his ability, where he says, I don't know how they could have done this otherwise. And importantly, though, he allows us, as the readers of this, to look at this detail and imagine, do we think that's actually done by hand only, or is there some form of machine involved that helped Ingres to work as perfect as he's done here? Hockney's also created a video that's been or that was screened on BBC, where he uses time-based media to make his case, to allow us to look at the work from the history of art in the way he wants us to look at this. And for this, I'm just moving myself a little bit out of the picture and play a short minute of that video for you.
In my studio, we pinned up hundreds of color photocopies of paintings. Paintings which seemed to have an optical look and paintings that did not. Slowly, we got a kind of order. I put Northern Europe at the top and Southern Europe at the bottom. The wall was necessary because I could then sit back and scan centuries of Western painting. We worked back further and further, and finally we got to a date where beyond that it is very different. And that date is approximately 1420. That date is when a big change occurs. That's been observed by every art historian. The explanations for it are everybody could suddenly draw better. Really? not that good an explanation, not that rational, really.
So I hope that you've been able to see how Hockney employed this camera move across these photocopies of paintings. So the way he's looking at the work over the history of art becomes the way we are looking at the work in the history of art. What's crucial for me at the moment is to say that Hockney opted for a book publication and a video, but within the work we receive and the way JAR has been set up, but as I said, also a number of other journals are being set up, video is integrating much more seamlessly into research communications now, but also other media. And I want to show you just one example at the moment of a very integrated piece of research publication, which is from Emilio Basai as a filmmaker, Memory as a Method for Filmmaking. And you'll see in a short moment when I start the video how we can move from different modes of reading and different modes of experiencing both video, images, and text to the other, and where, as we move across those on the page, an understanding of the practice of this particular artist emerges, as well as of its relevant for understanding, in this case, of memory and of a certain moment within the development of filmmaking. So as you open the page, the video will automatically start for you. You can then start scrolling at any moment and start reading little bits of text that are highlighted, foregrounded, but also then stop and read longer bits of text where the artist here explains his project and some of the concerns he's been interested in. You can move to other pages with a different visual as well as audio texture. You can see different sections highlighting, in this case, for instance, writing, how he's relating to writing in terms of memory and what writing does to memory. You see sketches, notebooks, other elements. I'm interested in this section here, Spoken Portrait, which is an experimental setup where he allows us to understand how these experiments were set up. And there's again a video section at the bottom here where we can see the experiment as it's been carried out.
Pues bueno, esta persona es un hombre, lo conozco desde prácticamente toda mi vida, entonces como que son diferentes momentos en el tiempo que están como un poco mezclados. Voy a intentar como quedarme en un solo punto en el tiempo, pero pues igual me empiezo a disparar. Medía 1.80, pero él siempre se sintió más grande y le decía a la gente que él era una persona muy alta y la gente pensaba que él era una persona muy alta y yo pensaba que era una persona muy alta, pero en realidad pues no era tan alto, era una persona que medía, pues sí, alrededor de 1.80. Le gustaba mucho hablar de Ali, del boxeador, de Muhammad Ali. Entonces siempre se me figuró que se parecía un poco a él y se parecía un poco a él realmente, ya en sus épocas decadentes, ¿no? Ya cuando tenía...
So each of these layers of text, information, documentation, and also instruction adds to a fuller, a richer image of what's happening here. As we're guided through those expositions, we understand the very specific proposal that's been made in this contribution. I selected a second example from JAR just to highlight this moment of documentation a bit more. In this case, soft robotic and post-human entities, Mats Bering Christiansen, Jonas Jørgensen, and so on, are the authors here, because they've added a whole page on the process and the documentation of that process. In this case, not by video, but by slideshow. And they show you basically the kind of steps they went through, initial tests. You see these slides here, descriptions of the processes they used. In this case, it's a quite technical research project about learning how to feel like plants are feeling, with the use of a soft robotic sleeve they're constructing, where basically sensor data from a plant is being transferred to this sleeve, so that we see, but also we feel on our arm how a plant might feel, or at least a different representation of sensory data collected from a plant. Again, you'll have to read this submission fully to understand this, but important here is there's loads of documentary material, so if you're interested in how that sleeve has been made and how they tested this and so on, there's ample of material here. So whether you're highlighting the aesthetic part of it in the first example, or whether you're highlighting how something's been made, we as readers get a better understanding of what it is that you as authors are looking at as the most important part of your studio practice. Another way of putting this is, again, practice as the element that is most open, most undefined within the studio context, and that artists and researchers employ documentary means, recording means, as a way to get hold of the practice they're doing. You may also say that actually in artistic research, as much as in scientific research, researchers are producing data through which they're able to make a case for the understanding and the knowledge that is being created within their work. And as I was suggested, the data itself isn't yet sufficiently by itself guiding an audience towards an understanding. There is, I think, the necessity of creating a layer in which that data is being presented specifically, interpreted or performed specifically, so an audience can actually understand the meaning associated to that data. So in our understanding, we would call the exposition from practice as research that we are looking at, or artists are moving from an artistic idea that's being dealt with in the studio to an epistemic claim. I'm just going to move myself back into the picture up here, so you can see me whilst I'm continuing with this presentation. So if you're looking at what kind of strategies artists may employ in this context to move from the studio to the page, we could say that relations are being created between different works, or narratives are being suggested that connect different work. Remember how Hockney connects Warhol and Ingres, or how different works are put side by side in particular ways. You can contextualize your work with other works, past or present, so you can demonstrate the specific side of that work, either by looking at other artists' work, what they do similarly to your work, or the points at which you work differently. So how do you contribute to knowledge in particular way? You require this context, perhaps. Or you can indicate through textual elements the debate within which the research functions. So you can say there's been this history of a problem and I'm adding this and that to it. You can highlight the process by which you've arrived at your work, or you can present certain concepts through which elements become perceptible that otherwise may not be seen in the studio work. You can use this publication as a means of teaching. So that's what you would do if you wanted to trace or follow what I've been doing. Do this, do that, do this. Set yourself up like this. Creating, you might say, blueprints or prototypes of engagement. You can indicate moments of collaboration, both in terms of the kind of resources necessary to work together and the different perspectives that come to the table, but also moments where audiences become co-creators of an understanding because they're scrolling in particular ways and they're interpreting the material in particular ways. And of course, you can highlight transdisciplinary, i.e., elements that are part of a more complex disciplinary environment. For instance, how, say, history and contemporary art practice might connect, or how an artist's understanding of natural science may impact their work and the knowledge they propose. Or you can highlight intermediate aspects, like in the case, again, we've seen where a portrait is being described that is then from memory transferred into a drawing carried out by somebody else in order to arrive at an image of the person that is being remembered. Or of course, you can present what the research investigates and contributes quite directly if you have this kind of direct outputs. And that's been an element I wanted to really communicate with you. Then you can create an aesthetic experience so an audience can actually experience by themselves what it is that you've done in the studio, what it is that you think is relevant for the audience, and how this experience may translate from objects to text, from performances to videos or recordings and so on, including how it may translate to the experience I have of a website or a book chapter or an exhibition catalog and so on. And of course, there's many more possible strategies. If you're coming from the peer review process, i.e. how would you assess such a complicated situation, again, I'm using JAR as a way to orientate you, and if you go online, you'll see a whole page dedicated to explaining how we do peer review, and there you'll find a link to the JAR peer review form. I think it's very interesting for any journal you're submitting to look at the ways in which they're assessing your submission. For today, though, I want to only look at JAR's process and only there on question number 3, because this, in a way, is the most important question around this move from studio to page, the modes in which artists are exposing their practice as research and communicating as research to the wider world. Now, as I suggested earlier, with this, the first diagram I showed, there are certain standards within academic publishing where we need to have quite explicit explanations. For instance, what is your research question? What is your methodology? What is the context within which you're operating? What are the results of the work you've done? And what are your conclusions that you're drawing? In our context here, and as you may have gathered, some of this may be more explicit than other elements. when we go to a reviewer and we are asking them to look at aesthetic elements, we cannot operate on the same level, meaning if somebody presents a research question in a visual way, there's no point in asking a reviewer about that question as if it was written down in text, and so on. So sometimes reviewers would look at a submission, including its aesthetic form it takes, and identify problems with that, and then they come back to us and say, yeah, good work, but I need more explicit explanation of what this piece is about. So we would then, in a revision process, ask the artists to explain better what this research is about. In other cases, where research questions aren't given, reviewers might say, yeah, but I'm completely fine with that. I get it, because for them, at least, it represents a successful presentation of the research question in a non-textual mode. And the same is true for method, the same is true for context, and so on, which means at the end of the day, there is, as you might say, a substitution happening where academic criteria for research can be partially or even fully substituted by artistic modes of working. And as a journal for artistic research, but also all the other journals I mentioned, are very much open to a process where artists don't have to follow the requirements that come from scientific or humanities type research, but we're actually trusting that we as artists are able to understand sufficiently, even if it's non-textual, what it is that happens within a submission. So fundamentally, the kind of work I've suggested around exposition works towards our field developing its own standards, its own criteria, and its own processes by which we publish and assess practices research. Now, this really means, and that's the end of my presentation today, that rather than looking at the creative act as something that is terminated before publication, and the discursive act, i.e. the dissemination of that work, happens afterwards in the publication, we are looking at a much more complex situation where actually publishing, because it engages artistically and aesthetically with the research, partially realizes what the project has created, giving form to, giving expression to elements that without the publication may not be articulated, at the same time as it also opens up potentials not yet addressed that, for instance, peer reviewers or audiences might have. So there's an open-ended dimension to that, which seems to be crucial, because this kind of open-endedness is something that we also know from art. In fact, if art were to be closed, it may not really function as art, because it would be understood and therefore finalized. Art's very much an open process. So at the end of this presentation, I want to, it's a really rapid presentation, I must apologize for that too. I want to highlight really some of the key elements that I've talked about. Fundamentally, as we move from studio to page, there is an issue to do with form. For artists, for creative practitioners, it may be possible to express what they're doing in non-artistic or academic forms, but we also have a developing field where artistic forms are becoming acceptable within academic publication. So we need to develop sensitivity towards these forms, in particular as they give evidence of the work that is being carried out. And the better this works, the less reviewers and editors rely on standards from outside of academic artistic disciplines. And you don't have to think about this as a black or white situation. It is perfectly fine, I think, to do both. So you can give examples of your creative work side by side to a reflective piece of writing or other forms of writing. That's absolutely fine. But the relationship of those two, as far as I'm concerned, needs to be dealt with quite sensitively, and how that sits side by side is always an issue of contention. Secondly, those relationships are very often part of the institutional frameworks of the different journals, but also within doctoral education, say, certain requirements that come in through examination boards and other kind of national agendas, i.e., sometimes you may think of quite creative solutions to what it is you're doing, but they may go too far as compared to the context for which you're preparing this publication. So keep that in mind, because you don't really want to be in a situation where you are really pushing the boat out and find readers of your work that are not skilled in or willing to take the aesthetic decisions so much into account as you do. And finally, I didn't speak about this too much, but you've seen this across the various examples that I gave. Artists are working, therefore, in multiple formats. There are publications as exhibition and exhibition catalogs, and there may be publications as text only, and there may be these hybrid rich media elements that bring those different worlds, as I mentioned, in much closer proximity. So you don't have to necessarily come up with one solution for the question of articulation of practice as research. It's absolutely fine and good and productive, in fact, if you're coming up with different formats. So imagine you're able to embody your research practice and your outputs in an exhibition or performance very successfully, and imagine you're able to do the same in a monograph very successfully. What people will understand about their project will be really rich, as compared to if you can do it only in the one or the other way. So experimenting with the different formats, including the very orthodox, extreme formats of only text or only work, is also very interesting and very productive. Anyway, I leave you with this. I hope that was helpful for your various situations. And as far as I understand, there will be some time for discussion, as well as some mentoring sessions later as well. So thank you for now.